Our next presentation bears the title, Practice Makes Perfect, Faith Makes Flourishing. Why faith in God is needed to acquire moral perfection. Please welcome Cade Frazier.
What kind of employee would you want to hire? Would you want to hire a rude employee who annoys his customers? What about a lazy employee who doesn't do his job? Or an employee who steals from you? Would you want to hire him? The answer to these questions is no. Now, consider what kind of spouse you'd want your child to marry. Would you want your child to marry a prideful spouse? What about a greedy spouse who steals from your child? Or a spouse who's always getting angry at your child? The answer to these questions is of course not. But the sad reality is that vicious people exist everywhere in the world. And not only do vicious people exist everywhere, but there's a lack of moral excellence known as virtue in the world. It is not unlikely for a boss to hire one of the employees described, and it is not impossible for your child to marry one of the spouses described. You see your children growing up in an unsteady and confusing world. How do we cultivate this moral excellence while tending to our faith? And how do we raise morally excellent children who advance their faith? Plato and Socrates argue that virtue is given to us as a gift from the gods. This virtue leads us to happiness. The happiness being referred to here is the Greek word eudaimonia, which is also translated as flourishing. Aristotle agrees with Plato and Socrates when they argue that virtue leads to eudaimonia. However, Aristotle believes that virtue is acquired through practice and habituation, as opposed to it being acquired as a gift from the gods. St. Thomas Aquinas agrees with Aristotle's methods of acquiring virtue. However, Aquinas asserts that faith is necessary to obtain complete moral virtue and ultimately eudaimonia. Although many argue that faith is not required to acquire complete moral virtue because the so-called virtuous pagan exists, I argue that faith is necessary to acquire complete moral virtue because complete moral virtue leads to eudaimonia, which is not obtainable in life on earth. Now, how does someone acquire virtue? Someone acquires virtue through truly believing in God. One who truly believes in God will also fear him, leading to wisdom. This is seen in Proverbs 9:10, which states the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. After a man fears the Lord, he can now begin to acquire wisdom through the Holy Spirit. James 1:5 claims that if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach. One can ask God for this wisdom, and after that, follow the laws of God. For the more wisdom someone has, the better they are able to follow these laws, and the more virtuous they become. As they become more virtuous, they simultaneously become less vicious. Therefore, someone who perfectly follows the law of God will be perfectly virtuous. But we know that no one can follow the law of God perfectly except for Jesus Christ. So, does this mean that no one can perfectly acquire virtue? No. God's laws can be perfectly followed, just not in this life. Once we die, if we truly believe in God and have given our lives up to Him, we will go to heaven. In heaven, we will fully be given God's wisdom, allowing us to fully acquire virtue. Therefore, faith is necessary to become excellent because God's wisdom is needed to completely acquire virtue. Eudaimonia, virtue, and faith go together like a root beer float. Virtue is the ice cream, faith is the root beer, and eudaimonia is the whole float. Ice cream is good without root beer, but root beer perfects ice cream, becoming the float. So too, virtue is good without faith, but faith perfects virtue, becoming eudaimonia. Many argue that if faith is required to acquire complete moral virtue, then how does the virtuous pagan exist? Furthermore, how are practitioners of other religions virtuous when they believe in a different God? Many define the virtuous pagan as a non-believer who leads a virtuous life. Many believe that Buddha was a morally virtuous person. Buddha spread a message of virtue, peace, and respect to all living beings. Buddha is also known to be born into Hinduism, a polytheistic religion. So, does this mean that faith is not required to acquire virtue since Buddha was virtuous and was not Christian? I concede that Buddha was somewhat excellent, but not fully excellent. Buddha only had some virtues and was unable to acquire complete moral virtue. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, the theological virtues are above man's nature because the object of the theological virtues is God himself. Buddha was unable to acquire the three theological virtues because he did not believe in the Judeo-Christian God Aquinas is referring to here. Buddha was thus unable to attain his true nature because he did not believe in the one true God. The virtuous pagan could not acquire faith, hope, and love, making it impossible for the virtuous pagan to exist. But faith, hope, and love are given to us in the holy baptism. They are given to us as gifts, as gifts from the Holy Spirit. Buddha never allowed the Holy Spirit to work into his life, meaning he was never able to acquire faith, hope, and love. And because Buddha was not able to acquire faith, hope, and love, he was unable to become completely virtuous. Complete moral virtue can only be acquired with faith and excellence working together. Now, consider this. Instead of constantly hiring rude, lazy employees, you now begin to hire wise, kind employees. Instead of your child marrying a greedy, angry, prideful spouse, your child marries a spouse that has faith, hope, and love. Many people in today's world view virtue as something that is not important. However, virtue is the key to true happiness, and God is the key to completely acquiring virtue. Do not be the so-called virtuous pagan. Be the virtuous Christian. The virtuous Christian thrives. The virtuous Christian achieves excellence. The virtuous Christian acquires God's wisdom, virtue itself, and flourishes. Tonight, I encourage you to not only be the virtuous Christian, but to encourage others to be the virtuous Christian. Practice God's commandments and seek the wisdom and gifts of the Holy Spirit. Thank you.